What does active listening look like? This is an active listening demonstration with an employee who has been sent to coaching. So whether you're a leader who wants to improve their active listening communication skills, or whether you are on the path of a professional master coach and you know that active listening is really a key competency, or if you are on the ICF credentialing path and you are looking to achieve PCC and MCC, this demonstration example is going to show you, first of all, what not to do with some common classic mistakes, some old-fashioned reflective listening and active listening habits that really get in the way. And then I'm going to show you how to coach a resistant client using active listening as the primary skill to build trust and rapport and to shift what could have been a disaster session into something that the client actually starts to enjoy and get value from. Right at the end, I'm going to also give you some very important do's and don'ts in the language of the ICF's competency listening actively, which is their competency number 6. So you could think of this as a mini active listening course focusing on some really important takeaways so that you can improve your active listening. Kathy, why did you book this coaching session?
I didn't book it. My boss did. Told me it'd be good for me, so here I am because apparently I need to be better.
Great, great. So what would you like to get out of our session today?
I don't know. I've got 100 emails waiting, so maybe I'd like to get out of this session fast.
Sounds like you're really not coping very well with your position, if I hear you correctly.
I didn't say that. I'm handling my position. It's everything else that's the problem.
So does that mean you're blaming other people for your situation?
If that's how you see it, I'm just telling you what's happening.
In that example, did you clearly see how I broke trust and rapport? I did not create emotional safety simply because I failed to actively listen. So instead of actually meeting the client where they are and backtracking, which is the jargon for weaving their words back into the space, I made some assumptions. I skipped to the next question. And overall, there was a mechanical tone. When we substitute our own words instead of the client's words, we risk inserting our assumptions. And the moment we do that, we can break the connection and break the trust. And you clearly heard how the client, even our AI ChatGPT simulated client, began to get irritated and just wanted to get the coaching over and done with. The simple act of active listening, the act of active listening, where we listen well enough to hear the most important part of what somebody is saying. And the most important part is either an insight, it's something they share about their goal, the long-term goal, or something they share about what they want from the session. When we hear those words and we weave them in to the next part of the conversation, we have actively listened with some skill. So now I'm going to take the same scenario, the same client, and I'm going to show you how we could have done better. Kathy, why did you book this coaching session today?
I didn't book it myself. My boss suggested it, so here I am. Because they think I need it.
They think you need it, but I'm kind of curious, how might this be potentially valuable for you?
I mean, I don't know yet, but if I'm here, I guess it wouldn't hurt to figure out how to get through this workload without losing my mind.
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense. If you were to get something, even something small out of the session that made this worth your time, what could that possibly be? To teach the YouTube algorithm that you want more coaching demonstrations because they're really, really helpful. Once you do that subscribe thing, it helps us because then we know you want more of these. And it also tells the YouTube bots that this kind of content is a priority for you.
Honestly, if I could walk out of here with even one thing that helps me stop feeling like I'm drowning, that'd be worth it.
Even one thing. And if you weren't drowning, what would you be experiencing instead?
I guess I'd feel more in control. Like I'm leading this launch, not just reacting to everything thrown at me.
More in control. Why?
Yeah.
Yeah, why is being more in control important to you, Kathy?
Because that's when I feel like I'm actually doing my job, not just surviving it.
So I'm going to invite you for a moment just to walk me through a day when you do feel like you're in control and you're just doing your job. Just take your time and unpack what that might look like.
All right. I guess on a day like that, I'd start by setting the priorities for my team. I'd delegate without second guessing, and I'd actually have time to think instead of just putting out fires all day.
So there'd be this moment of prioritizing for your team, and then specifically you're mentioning time to think. Why is time to think important for you?
Because that's when I can see the bigger picture, make decisions that actually matter instead of just reacting to what's urgent in the moment.
I'm going to throw something out there and just tell me if this works for you or not. If you had to imagine that moment of stopping, taking time to think, and seeing the bigger picture, just use your imagination. What changes inside of your felt sense of that moment?
I think I'd feel less tight in my chest, more clear headed, like I'm actually steering things instead of just bracing for impact.
That clear-headed feeling, what does it do to your breathing?
It slows it down, I think. More steady, less shallow.
It slows it down, more steady, less shallow. And if you had to slow down your breathing now, just breathing as if you're in that bigger picture felt sense, what happens for you?
I guess I feel a little bit of that tension drop. It's subtle, but it's there.
It's subtle, but it's there. How do you know it's there?
I can feel my shoulders drop a bit, and I'm not gripping my jaw so tight.
The shoulders drop, the jaw is
Yeah.
less tight. So what if, and here's just a radical idea, what if this coaching session can give you that time to think and help you to access this bigger picture with this clear-headed, slowing down, subtle shift?
Yeah. I think that could actually be something I need, even if I didn't realize it.
So to honor that it might be something you need. I'm curious, out of 10, if 10 out of 10 is really important and 0 isn't important at all, how important do you think it is to take some time to think, to see the bigger picture?
I'd say that's a solid 9 out of 10 right now.
A solid 9. And if we look at your day-to-day work, an average week, how much time to think are you giving yourself or being able to carve out of your average day?
Probably a 2 at best, if I'm honest. Then yeah, I've got a long way to go from that too.
Where would you like to take that prioritizing time to think, let's say in the next month?
I'd like to get closer to, I don't know, maybe a 5 or a 6. Something realistic, but enough to make a difference.
5 or 6, realistic, but just enough to make a difference. So today, with the remaining time that we have in our session, considering where you ultimately want to be at that 5 or 6, giving yourself time to think. What would you like to walk away with at the end of our time?
I think I'd want at least one concrete way to start carving out that time, even if it's small, something I can actually try this week.
So one way to carve out your time to think that you can use this week.
Exactly. Something I can take and put into practice and see if it moves me closer to that 5 or 6.
And if you did walk away today with that one way to carve out the time to think and to start implementing that and checking if it's working, how would that feel at the end of the session?
It'd feel like this coaching wasn't just another meeting on my calendar. It'd feel worth it.
It would feel worth it. Well, I'm here to do my best to give you this time to make it as worth it as possible. And I'm looking forward to jumping in and having that conversation.
I appreciate that. Let's see what we can come up with.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. We want to be okay when our clients are not okay. In InnerLifeSkills language, I call it being equal to. So being equal to means I'm willing to be equal to whatever my client is experiencing: vulnerability, resistance, impatience, irritation. And if I am a safe space for that, it's going to dissolve and it's going to resolve. Resolve and dissolve, that rhymes. The other thing you heard me do is acknowledge her frustration, which means that we don't skip it. We don't miss or dismiss, using ICF's language. The ICF very regularly in their PCC markers talk about how important it is for PCC and MCC coaches in particular not to minimize the client's experience and not to miss or dismiss. Missing means we miss the opportunity, we don't hear, we don't respond properly. And of course, we don't want to dismiss. We don't want to brush off the client's experience, their emotions, their perceptions. We want to be a safe container, but that does not mean we are actively reflecting words that will take us into a spiral down. So we create the container, we show empathy, we show up like a human being and be kind. And then when it feels natural, we start gently pulling the session back towards spiraling up by listening and using our coaching ears for the language of what the client wants. We start to move the session towards something productive, something proactive. And you'll find that the moment you start picking up even 1 or 2 words from the client that honors that you've heard them, it's going to tell that client subconsciously, wow, this coach is actually listening to me. The coach doesn't have an agenda on behalf of someone else, particularly in executive coaching, where essentially the coach is hired. We are placed. And often the executive, the client, hasn't necessarily always volunteered, or if they have, it hasn't been on their own behalf that they have sought out a coach. Now, while we are setting up a coaching agreement and planning to coach, especially when there's third-party sponsors like a company hiring an external coach, we want to make sure that everybody is on board and that everybody is in agreement about what the nature of the coaching is, the confidentiality, the logistics, and most importantly, the expectations. That will go a long way to preventing what we heard in the beginning of this example, where the coach is showing up with quite a bit of resistance. But even with good, solid coaching agreements in place and a lot of transparency and doing our due diligence, etc., you may find that that still happens. The client's busy today. The client is frustrated. And in this instance, the client is under a lot of pressure. So it's so important to be a good container for that without spiraling down and still starting to draw out and excavate what the client really wants. And most importantly, what will make it valuable for them. Because if it's not valuable to the client, they don't want to be there. They're going to resist the coaching itself. So once we started digging into what the client really wanted, this time to think language came into play, where the client really started talking about wanting prioritizing, wanting to do her job, wanting to see the bigger picture. And these were all insights. They were all important keywords, which I mirrored back to the client either as a pure backtrack, just mentioning the word, or weaving it into a question, weaving it into a comment, and focusing on that. Can you imagine if I didn't reflect this language back to the client? Imagine if I swapped or substituted. If she said time to think, but I said something else entirely. I made an assumption, like I did in the first example, which was a clear disaster. If I had made an assumption, oh, yes, you're not coping, you're stressed. That's a negative example. But even if we gave a slightly more positive example, but still substituted with our own words, we would have broken something in the session. We would have lost connection. Imagine the client says, I would love to have time to think. And I said, creating some me time or stepping back from the stress. Even if I did my best to match some of the intention, when we make assumptions and when we substitute our own words into the active listening and the mirror reflective listening, we put ourselves at great risk and we risk breaking the connection with the client. It is far simpler, it is far cleaner, it is actually far easier to actively listen and to reflect the client's actual words back. Now, if I continue to coach this client, by the end of the session, I would be checking in on whether we've accomplished what she wanted, found her one way to carve out time to think, because that becomes the session's objective. Did you also see the lateral creative coaching moment where I connected her wanting time to think to a possible use of the coaching session itself? And that type of creative, create and invent a question in the moment to meet the client where they are, can be really, really powerful. It's going to come from your intuition. It's going to come from the spontaneity of meeting the client right then and there. So here are some do's and don'ts in ICF language. And I think when you think back on the example and demonstration that I've just given you of active listening and reflective listening, you will notice how this showed up. What we do want to do is we want to hear, so we definitely want to be listening, and then question or share. So remember, you don't always have to ask questions. If you keep asking questions endlessly in a coaching session, if it's the only way you respond, you're going to sound like an interrogation. It's going to be like playing tennis with your client. So every now and then you do want to drop in something that's more like a comment, but remember, not an assumption and definitely not a judgment. Yes? Very importantly, fully customized around your client's sharing, which is another way of saying using their words. Another important thing you could do is you could inquire or explore. So inquiry means it's once off, one little question. Explore means deeper. You could check in what the client means by a certain word. What did they mean by time to think? And that unpacked a whole beautiful, rich part of the conversation. But you can't do that too often. You don't want to be checking every single word, right? It's those important words, words relating to the goal, words relating to what they want from the session, or words relating to a key solution. You also want to potentially sometimes check in with emotions and with tone, but again, don't overdo it. Don't every 3 or 4 questions later be checking on feelings and tone. The ICF are big fans of us watching for and noticing mismatches or energy shifts, where the client is saying one thing but their body language or their tone is saying something else, or where the energy has changed. They went from being very motivated and very up to suddenly quiet down, or they went from feeling very resistant to suddenly being very open. We might also want to check in, it's a similar topic, with their nonverbal cues, with body language, which of course I wasn't able to show you in this example, but we could check in with that occasionally. It's an MCC, Master Coaching Competency, to track changes from one session to another session. So imagine noticing a change in behavior that your client is starting to demonstrate and reflecting that and mentioning it and exploring it over a period of 3 or 4 sessions. We also want to definitely check in with our clients' perceptions, their values, their wants, and their needs. And in the example that I've given you, we were really leaning into what the client wanted, even what they wanted from coaching itself, because they arrived unclear and resistant. Another thing you can do to achieve PCC and even MCC competencies for listens actively is summarize or reflect to clarify understanding. And of course, succinctly means short and sweet, not long, wafty things, because we want to do less of the talking ultimately in an entire coaching session. What we don't want to do is use a very old-fashioned way of reflecting and actively listening, where we start with, so if I understand you correctly, or so if I hear you. That's something we want to drop, and we want to keep it much more clean. We definitely do want to match our client's perceptual language. What does that mean? It means that if our clients are using a lot of visual language, they're talking about seeing things, they're talking about vision. Oh, I see you. I see what you're saying. Then we want to lean into that kind of language. If they're talking about hearing, I hear you, listening, and there's a sense that they are more auditory in their dominant way of perceiving, we want to lean into that language. And if they lean into what's called kinesthetic language styles, which is felt, sense, knowing, we want to match that. That being said, however, and this is just something I've noticed, I still think there is so much value in dropping in a little bit of a somatic check-in, even for a client who doesn't necessarily demonstrate that as a dominance. What we definitely don't want to do is we don't want to interrupt a client without a reason. Now, in my example, we didn't actually show that, but you can imagine if the client is busy sharing, they're busy unpacking something, and we just interrupt them, we talk over them. That is clearly going to be breaching active listening and probably also interfere with some of the other core competencies as well. The only reason we would do this, and we would do it very skillfully and very carefully, is if the client was going deeply into the story, into the pain and the problem, to the point that the session starts to tip from coaching into counseling or therapy. And there we wouldn't be blunt, but we would wait for a natural pause, and we might want to check in with the client, what they needed, and we might want to even be putting a little flag in our mind about whether this actually is clearly a coaching session and whether the client understands and has the right expectations for the session. One of the most helpful reframes I have found in that type of situation is to just gently lead them back into what they want from the coaching session. So they've started spiraling down into the story potentially. We listen for a while, we pause, we wait for a natural moment, and then we say, so I'm curious, I'm hearing your story, but what would you like to work on today that leads you more towards where you want to be? So we start leaning back into the language of what the client wants. We start looking at goals or change that they want to make, and then we gently move the session that way. You'll notice in the poor example that I gave you, I did put in some silence fillers, and notice how blunt they were, saying, great, okay, great. We want to hold space, and even though we are weaving our client's words in, we don't want to fill the listening time and the thinking time with, great, okay. That's going to strengthen your active listening to remove that. We also don't want to use generic responses like the old-fashioned, so if I understand you correctly, or if I hear you, what you're saying is. We don't need to do any of that. It actually is quite disruptive, and if used too often can subconsciously start making a client wonder, well, are you actually listening, that you keep having to say, if I hear you, if I understand you? I mentioned this earlier, but it's so important. We don't want to dismiss or miss the client's emotions or their nonverbal cues. We also don't want to just skip over something significant that they have said. We don't want to mismatch their tone or their pace. If the client is serious or very focused or seems a little bit down, we don't want to suddenly be lighthearted, yeah? And if the client's very lighthearted, we don't want to be too serious in our tone. That doesn't mean we change entirely, but it means that we lean in to the tone that our client is showing up with. And so important, I think you heard this especially in the bad example that I gave you, and that is assumptions. We don't want to make assumptions about what the client means and then insert those words into the coaching. And lastly, even though we're great fans of backtracking, using the client's words, we don't want to overdo it either. We don't want to be mirroring everything endlessly back to the client. We want to sometimes use one word, sometimes skip it entirely, especially if the client is spiraling down or if it seems more like backstory. It's really only the goal words, the objective of the session words, the solution or insights, the aha moment words, the words that contribute to the progress of the session. Those are the ones we want to focus on. If you enjoyed the piece in this demo about somatic coaching and how it can elevate your coaching to a professional level, and if you're on the ICF track, this video on somatic coaching as a solution to achieve PCC MCC is probably the one you want to watch next. And of course, I have an entire playlist dedicated to these competencies, which you want to check out. If you're subscribed, you're also going to get notifications of the next coaching demonstration video or helpful tutorials like this one that help natural coaches become go-to master coaches.